In the early years of childhood, experiences can be profoundly shaping, creating a deep connection to family. There's a certain closeness that defines what we mean by family, one that grows and evolves. Over the course of a decade, a family expands, and with it, the bonds of connection grow stronger. Then, one single sentence on the royal website broke the usual silence. It came without any explanation, just a simple line. A formal announcement will be made at 6 p.m. For a monarchy that rarely acts without meticulous planning and protocol, this felt like an unexpected break from tradition. No secret leaks to trusted journalists, no whispers from palace aides, just a timestamp. That alone sent shockwaves through the royal watching community. People didn't need anything more than that to know something was wrong. The lack of detail was a red flag. Journalists scrambled to find answers, phones ringing off the hook with questions no one could answer. Newsrooms extended their airtime, speculating wildly, with some theories absurd and others disturbingly plausible. Was there a health crisis, an unexpected abdication? Had someone been forced out, or was someone stepping into power? The absence of information only increased the tension. And this wasn't just media speculation. Even seasoned royal insiders were reportedly left in the dark. There had been no briefings, no talking points. If this had been orchestrated, it had bypassed the usual gatekeepers. That in itself raised the stakes, because in the monarchy, silence without structure is never without reason. Then, the shift began. Quiet at first, but unmistakable. All eyes turned to William and Kate. They had skipped a planned appearance earlier in the day, and their absence now seemed impossible to ignore. If the announcement had come from the king or queen, they would have been the ones to speak, but they hadn't, and the timing felt far too deliberate to be coincidental. What followed wasn't just curiosity, it was anticipation. The nation wasn't just waiting for an announcement, they were preparing for something that could reshape the monarchy itself. It wasn't the message that unsettled people, it was the silence that preceded it. When the clock struck 6, the royal script was rewritten by two unexpected figures. When the screen lit up, it wasn't King Charles or Queen Camilla, but William and Kate. There was no throne behind them, no ceremonial banners, no guards standing at attention off camera. Just the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in a simple quiet room that looked more like a private office than a royal stage. And yet, in that stillness, they commanded more power than any crown could offer. For the first time in recent memory, the royal message didn't come from the reigning monarch or his consort. It came from the heirs themselves, speaking not as symbols of tradition, but as leaders in their own right. William began, and there was no grand greeting or homage to lineage. He spoke clearly and with conviction, each word carrying more weight. The monarchy is not just a symbol, he said, it's a responsibility. That one sentence felt like a quiet reckoning, not a rebellion, but certainly a redirection. And to those listening closely, it was clear that this wasn't just a personal statement, it was a public shift in philosophy. Kate followed without hesitation. Her voice was controlled but not soft, walking the line between grace and urgency. This isn't about tradition, she said, it's about trust. And just like that, centuries of royal rituals were distilled into something deeper, something modern. The message wasn't about who wore the crown, but who could be trusted to carry it. Not because of bloodline, but because of purpose. There were no advisors hovering in the background, no family photos suggesting the approval of King Charles or Queen Camilla. William and Kate were alone, standing for something far greater than themselves. Their appearance wasn't a broadcast, it was a declaration. The old way of doing things was no longer the only way. This wasn't a rejection of the monarchy, but a redefinition of its role in the modern world. Their tone wasn't angry or emotional. It was steady and grounded, as if they had prepared for this moment not in secrecy, but in silence, waiting for the right time to step forward with a message not of division, but of clarity. They weren't demanding loyalty, they were offering transparency. In a monarchy built on myth, that alone felt revolutionary. Their words didn't echo through grand halls or ornate windows. They landed in living rooms, on phones, and in hearts. It didn't feel rehearsed, it felt chosen. As they concluded their message, the tension that had been building since that morning didn't fade. It shifted into something more profound than just an announcement. And then came the bombshell that would change everything. The Diana Initiative. Kate wasn't just honoring the past, she was reclaiming it. When she stepped forward and introduced the Diana Initiative, it wasn't framed as a tribute. It was framed as a correction, a course realignment. It was a statement that Princess Diana's legacy would no longer be confined to flowers at Kensington or memories replayed every August. This was about restoring a voice that had been softened, reshaping a presence that had been pushed aside, and taking back a narrative that had been diluted by time, scandal, and silence. But this time, Diana's mission wouldn't rely on symbolic gestures. It would move with purpose.
The Diana Initiative was established as a global nonprofit, its foundation rooted in the values that made Diana so beloved: compassion for the marginalized, radical transparency in a world of controlled appearances, and a relentless drive to serve people over protocol. This wasn't a passion project disguised as charity, it was a strategy. And Kate wasn't just the founder, she was its driving force. From the moment it was announced, it became clear that Kate wasn't lending her name. She was giving her full presence. There would be no red carpets, no press-controlled events where royals wave and leave. Kate made it known she would personally visit shelters, meet underserved families, listen to survivors and advocates face-to-face, often in quiet, unpublicized conversations that weren't meant for headlines at all. She wasn't looking for admiration, she was determined to be useful. The public quickly took notice. The initiative wasn't just launched, it was felt. It echoed Diana's hands-on approach, but this time it had structure, reach, and long-term plans. It gave the people something they hadn't seen from the royal family in years, a cause that transcended performance. Kate wasn't filling Diana's shoes, she was carving a new path in her spirit. A continuation of grace, empathy, and action, but shaped for a new generation. For those who remembered Diana's quiet battles against the institution, this felt like a long overdue redemption arc. But the difference was power. Kate wasn't fighting from the margins, she was leading from within the heart of the monarchy. And that made all the difference. Support came quickly. Social media trended with phrases like "People's Queen," resurrected from Diana's memory, and now applied to Kate without hesitation. It wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. People saw someone who wasn't waiting to be queen to start leading. Someone who had chosen to carry the weight of responsibility before it was officially handed over. And most powerfully, someone who reminded them of what service should truly look like. However, not everyone welcomed this tribute, especially not Queen Camilla. While the public roared with approval, the palace remained silent. The Diana Initiative struck a chord across the country and around the world, and the response was electric. Social media buzzed with praise. Global outlets carried the story with headlines crowning Kate, not with jewels, but with something far more powerful: public trust. But inside the palace, the silence grew louder. There were no congratulatory statements from the king, no words of encouragement from Queen Camilla. The official accounts remained still, as if the announcement had never happened. It wasn't just silence, it was deliberate absence. Behind the scenes, insiders revealed the mood was anything but celebratory. Charles was reportedly blindsided, asking aides, "What did they do?" He wasn't angry, he was stunned. Just as he was beginning to settle into his reign, the spotlight had shifted, and not gently. The country wasn't looking to the monarch, it was looking to his son and daughter-in-law, who had just unveiled an initiative far more ambitious and emotionally resonant than any royal project in recent memory. If Charles was shocked, Camilla was shaken. For years, she had fought to reshape her public image. Through charity work, quiet consistency, and the king's support, she had painstakingly moved from scandal to soft power. But with one announcement, one emotionally charged homage to Diana, the public's gaze turned once again, not with animosity, but with clarity. Kate's initiative wasn't an attack, it was a challenge to the very institution Camilla had worked so hard to transform. The name Diana brought with it a weight Camilla had spent decades trying to escape. It threatened to overshadow her once more. Inside the palace, murmurs of resentment began. Kate's actions had captured the public's attention, but they had not gone through the usual channels. There was no royal rubber stamp, no senior oversight, just independence, decisiveness, and unstoppable momentum. That independence unnerved those still clinging to the old ways. Kate's presence felt like a direct contrast to the monarchy's institutional coldness, and it further isolated the palace. Yet there was no public fallout. No dramatic confrontations, but for those closest to the crown, it was clear this wasn't just tension, it was the beginning of something much deeper. A shift in loyalty, a quiet but unmistakable test of power, legacy, and public trust. What began as a silence soon became a quiet war behind closed doors. For centuries, the monarchy had survived through spectacle, crowns, parades, and handshakes, but William and Kate weren't playing a part in history, they were rewriting it. What followed wasn't just a campaign, it was the birth of a new philosophy: relevance, transparency, and presence.
They weren't cutting ribbons. They were cutting through years of hollow tradition, and they weren't waiting for approval to do it. Their presence would be felt, not in grand ballrooms, but in shelters and overcrowded clinics, in classrooms still recovering from a broken system, in flood zones and mental health wards. They weren't performing royalty, they were redefining leadership. The shift was subtle but deliberate. New projects began rolling out that addressed the real issues people cared about: climate resilience, adolescent mental health, maternal safety, early education, and equity. Each initiative wasn't just a gesture, it was backed by planning, partnership, and most importantly, accountability. Meetings weren't press events, they were strategy sessions. Field visits weren't scheduled for a photo op, they were opportunities to learn, listen, and act. It quickly became clear that this wasn't about short-term popularity, it was about permanence, a recalibration of what the monarchy stood for and who it served. William and Kate weren't tearing down the crown. They were lifting it off its pedestal and placing it back within reach of the people. The very idea of royalty, once rooted in distance, was being replaced by something radically different: accessibility. And it wasn't a rebellion, it was a correction. A long overdue admission that tradition without relevance was no longer sustainable. While the public applauded this evolution, the institution they belonged to recoiled. Because change, no matter how well-intentioned, always disrupts power. William and Kate weren't just working around the old system, they were exposing its failings. Quietly, without confrontation, but with precision. And that was enough to unsettle those still clinging to legacy over leadership. But within the palace, this bold shift wasn't seen as visionary, it was seen as a betrayal. For William, it wasn't defiance, it was duty. He hadn't set out to upstage his father. He hadn't launched the Diana Initiative to provoke a shift in power. But when the public embraced the new model of monarchy, one built on purpose rather than pageantry, it became impossible to ignore the emotional cost playing out behind palace walls. In private, King Charles reportedly struggled to make sense of it all. "The spotlight is gone," he confided to an aide. Not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with something more painful: quiet sorrow. After a lifetime of waiting to wear the crown, he now found himself eclipsed by a new kind of leadership that didn't need titles to command loyalty. For William, that realization cut deeper than anyone knew. He had braced for tension, he had expected disagreements. But the coldness, the absence of even a simple acknowledgement from his father, was never part of the plan. He hadn't betrayed the monarchy, he was trying to preserve what still mattered within it. But instead of unity, he was met with a wall of silence, and behind it, a father who saw his son's purpose as a personal loss. Camilla's reaction, however, wasn't quiet. While the king stood still, she moved to reassert control. Sources close to the palace revealed she urged that the Diana Initiative be brought under official royal oversight, folded into the established hierarchy, sanitized and contained. Her concern wasn't just about visibility, it was about legacy, about not losing the ground she had spent years earning. Diana's name, once revived and adored, had haunted her. Now it threatened to overshadow her once again. But the palace's own advisors pushed back. The optics of seizing control over something born from compassion and grassroots service would be disastrous. It would look petty, controlling, even jealous. So they chose another path: passive resistance. No public statements, no coordinated support, just silence. Let it burn bright and fizzle out. That was the hope, but it didn't. William saw the tactic for what it was, and he didn't flinch. "This isn't a discussion," he told an aide. "It's a strategy." He wasn't asking for permission. He was building something that didn't need approval to matter. And in that conviction, he quietly severed himself from the old way of doing things, not to destroy it, but to evolve it. The divide between father and son wasn't loud. There were no public disputes, no harsh words exchanged for the cameras to catch. But the space between them widened all the same, not out of hatred, but out of vision. One clinging to a reign built over decades, the other reaching for a future that could no longer wait. Behind the curtains, influence was shifting, and fast. No decree was signed, but the crown's gravity was moving. The shift didn't happen with a royal announcement or a public handover. It unfolded quietly, but unmistakably. Eyes that once followed Charles and Camilla by default, now instinctively turned toward William and Kate. News segments began opening with their names. Headlines highlighted their engagements. Editorials speculated, not about what they might inherit, but what they were already reshaping. The monarchy, long defined by lineage, was beginning to follow something much more volatile: public attention. And attention once lost is rarely reclaimed. Inside media circles, the calculus changed. Coverage of Charles's ceremonial duties, once seen as standard, began to feel flat and uninspired. Meanwhile, every move William and Kate made sparked conversation. When they showed up unannounced to a youth center, it trended for days. When they spoke on climate resilience, it drew global commentary. The shift wasn't superficial, it was foundational, and the palace press office noticed. More tellingly, royal aides began redirecting their energy. Briefings that once flowed through Buckingham started moving through Kensington. Young staffers sought assignments tied to the Diana Initiative. Photographers no longer clustered outside Clarence House. They followed where the energy was. And that energy increasingly came from William and Kate's world. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't sabotage. It was realignment. A quiet recognition that credibility now carried more weight than protocol. Even junior royals, once unsure of their place in an aging institution, began seeking out the Kensington team. Not for visibility, but for purpose. They wanted to understand how this new model worked, why it resonated, and how they could contribute without being swallowed by tradition. For the first time in years, the monarchy wasn't just reacting to public pressure, it was evolving alongside it. Quietly, steadily, and with intent. And while no official titles were shifted, something far more powerful occurred. The court of public opinion rendered its verdict. William and Kate weren't waiting for a coronation to be seen as the future. They were already leading, not from above, but from beside. Their influence didn't come from bloodlines, it came from actions.
And those actions were beginning to define the entire tone of the modern monarchy. In palace halls still governed by hierarchy, it might not have seemed like a revolution. But outside those walls, something undeniable was happening. The monarchy was no longer a relic, polished for ceremonial display. It was becoming something real, responsive and human. Not by accident, and certainly not by order, but by choice, by connection, by a willingness to listen before leading. In one quiet moment, they didn't just make history, they redefined what royalty means in the 21st century.